Welcome everyone to this lecture in our 2021 lecture series hosted by the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. My name is Doretta Sobolewski. I'm the research coordinator here at the museum, and today I am delighted to have Dr. Lois Leveen with me. Dr. Leveen earned degrees in history and literature from Harvard University, the University of Southern California, and UCLA. A former faculty member at UCLA and Reed College, she is now a public humanities scholar, leading programs at museums, libraries, K-12 schools, and universities. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times, and similar outlets, and in scholarly journals and academic books. Having turned a footnote from her dissertation into the novel The Secrets of MaryBowser, she's now researching the first scholarly biography on Mary Richards Denman, the real figure behind the MaryBowser myth. Welcome, Lois. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, especially celebrating Juneteenth this year.
Absolutely. Before we get started with your presentation, could you tell me a little how you got interested in MaryBowser?
Yeah, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the presentation. When I was in graduate school, I was actually doing my PhD in a literature department, although my field was African-American literature, and there's a lot of crossover when you do African-American literature with African-American history. And I had been writing and reading and researching and teaching about the anti-slavery movement. And I came across just a few paragraphs in a book that was newly out at that point on African-American women's history. And it just mentioned this, the MaryBowser story, which was that MaryBowser had been born enslaved in Virginia, but was educated in the North and had come back to the South, and during the Civil War was a spy for the Union by pretending to be a slave in the Confederate White House. And I thought, oh, this is so interesting because it sort of encapsulated so much of what I was teaching and writing about. And I thought, this could be a story that could really grab people's attention. And I ended up writing a novel, as you said, about her. So I say that in some ways, the project I'm doing now is both a pleasure and a penance, because now I'm doing the work of a historian. And instead of, it's much easier to write a novel. It's hard to write a novel as an academic because I had to learn how to write like a novelist. But yeah, when you can't find something as a novelist, you can make it up as long as it's plausible. You don't get to do that as a historian. So it takes a lot more work. Although I will say that what I'm learning in this project is that truth really is both stranger and more compelling than fiction.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very exciting story, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So if you'd like to go ahead.
Sure. So I want to start again by thanking you, Doretta, and the museum for having me speak. And I also want to thank everybody who's watching today for taking the time to learn about America's past. And I always like to start my presentations by noting that I'm giving this talk on land that is very near the confluence of the Wimal and Willamette rivers, also called the Columbia and Willamette rivers. And I want to acknowledge Portland, Oregon's ongoing debt to the indigenous people, past and present, of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tumwater, Wasco, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes and stewarded the lands and the waters here. They are the rightful inhabitants of the places in which I live and work, and they were forcibly dispossessed and removed from their homes and their land by the US government. And I encourage you, wherever you are, to think about how such legacies shaped and continue to shape whatever place you are watching from. Land acknowledgements like this remind us not only of America's history, but of the need to act now in the future to address this history. And it's interesting to start with a land acknowledgement like that, because history is really, in some ways, the topic of the talk today. When most of us first encountered the study of history, it was in school. And it was usually taught in a way that made it seem like everything about the past was already known. And all we had to do was memorize a bunch of names and dates and other facts in case they came up on the test. That is not how historians actually think about history. Historical research is a complex, creative, and challenging process. It involves unearthing written documents, visual images, material culture, and other evidence from particular times and places, and then reinterpreting that evidence as rigorously as we can to piece together what people in the past did and why and how they did it. Sometimes new evidence emerges, forcing us to rethink what we previously believed, and even sparking debates among the historical experts. Often when we undertake historical research, historians don't know what evidence may still exist or where exactly we may find it. And that means historical research can be frustratingly slow and difficult, but it is also fascinating, which is one of the reasons we keep at it. And the other reason we keep at it is because understanding the past as accurately as we can is key to understanding the present. So my goal for today is really to demonstrate this historical process, to give you a peek into what it's like to think like a historian. And one of the things I hope to show is the immense care it takes to get history right. And that's especially true for African-American history, for women's history, and thus for African-American women's history. We'll explore why this history is both so challenging to document and so important to understand through the life of one historically significant but elusive African-American woman. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here so you can see some slides, see how smoothly this goes. Perfectly smoothly. So my title for the talk today is Jousting with History on a Stick: What Commemorations of MaryBowser Richards Denman Reveal About How to Center African-American Women in U.S. History. Now, history on a stick is kind of a playful term for historical markers. Those are those things that are placed on roadsides or buildings or other sites to inform the public about significant person or significant place or a significant event. And the reason the name Bowser is in quotation marks, that's something we'll explore together. Now, in April of this year, Virginia officially decided to add 5 new historical markers to its state historical marker program, including one for a woman identified in the official press release as Mary Richards Bowser. But if you were walking along East Grace Street in Richmond, Virginia, you would find there's already this marker, erected in 1994. It reads, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, freed slave of the Van Leeuw family and indispensable partner to Elizabeth Van Leeuw in her pro-Union espionage work. She worked at the Confederate White House, gathering and passing on military intelligence to the Union through Van Leeuw to General Grant. Here's the thing, if you stroll just another few feet, you find another marker. This one was put up in 2005, and it's longer. I'm just going to read the first part of it to you. Richmond Mayor Dr. John Adams built a mansion here in 1802. It became the residence of Elizabeth Van Leeuw, 1818 to 1900, whose father obtained it in 1836. During the Civil War, Elizabeth Van Leeuw led a Union espionage operation. African Americans, such as Van Leeuw's associate Mary Jane Richards, whose story closely parallels that of the legendary spy Mary Elizabeth Bowser, served in Richmond's Unionist underground. Whoa. It looks like this history on a stick stuff gets really sticky pretty quick. So that's part of what we're going to explore. But before we do, close your eyes for a moment while I reread the very first sentence of one of these markers. Richmond Mayor Dr. John Adams built a mansion here in 1802. What does that word mansion conjure up for you? What do you think? What do you see? What do you feel when you consider that word? What do you think it would be like to be inside a mansion? Now, if you open your eyes, you'll see that this is the building that's being referred to in that sign. Now imagine approaching this building, entering this building, being in this building, but imagine it from the perspective of an enslaved little girl. What entrance would you use? What spaces would you be in? What would your experience be of them? We seldom think of history through this perspective, focusing first on Black experience, on female experience, on the experience of children, on the experience of the enslaved. For decades, most of mainstream American history was written by white men, and what they thought of as important and objective was really quite limited by their own perspective. And even in efforts to correct these limitations, to open up history to include the presumably marginalized, we can produce new inaccuracies. One reason for this is that we love the trope of a lone hero who succeeds against all odds. Much of American popular history follows this trope. In its earliest manifestations, that hero was almost always a white male. But simply expanding who occupies the role of lone hero by gender or race or ethnicity can make us think we're being more accurate when we are actually erasing the contributions of everyone but that lone hero. And sometimes we get so excited with the idea of adding more diversity to our pantheon of lone heroes that we don't take the time to document and interpret the history accurately. So, in 1911, William Bowman, who was a white writer for Harper's Magazine, wrote a series of articles about Civil War spies. And to his credit, his series included this article about a woman spy, Richmond's own Elizabeth Van Leeuw. Van Leeuw was a white woman in Virginia, and her efforts to support the federal government are definitely noteworthy. They remind us that not everyone who lived in the South supported secession. But of course, the Southerners who had the greatest at stake in defeating secession were the millions of enslaved and free African Americans who resided across the South. They thwarted Confederates and supported the Federals in many ways. Yet in this 16-page article, all of African American experience is reduced to one paragraph about one person, invoked, and I use this term advisedly, to add color to a story that was really about a white woman. And here's what the paragraph says. It's about Van Leeuw. Her method of reaching President Davis in his least guarded moments is evidence of her genius as a spy and a leader of spies. The Van Leeuws had owned a Negro girl of unusual intelligence. Several years before the war, she'd been given her freedom, sent north, and educated at Miss Van Leeuw's expense. This young woman, whose name was Mary Elizabeth Bowser, was now sent for. She came, and for a time she was coached and trained for her mission. Then, in consummation of Miss Van Leeuw's scheming, she was installed as a waitress in the White House of the Confederacy. What she was able to learn, how long she remained behind Jefferson Davis's dining chair, and what became of the girl ere the war ended are questions to which time has effaced the answers. Now, I want to note that the word Negro, though it sounds dated to us today, was not a slur, nor did it have any derogatory connotations. It was used in the 19th century and much of the 20th century in the way that we might use African American or Black today. But still, there is much that is troubling about this passage. We have an adult African American who is repeatedly referred to as a girl. We have the note of her unusual intelligence, which implies that Blacks are usually not intelligent. We have a huge emphasis on the white woman's genius, her benevolence, her expertise. Apparently, she did not need to be coached and trained, only this Negro girl did. And of course, her agency in deciding what was going to happen versus the passivity of this Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who is clearly in the role of servant, not just imposing in the Davis household, but also in always doing Van Leeuw's bidding. Now, I've been through William Bowman's papers there at the University of Texas at Austin, and in earlier drafts of this article, this paragraph doesn't appear. It was based on a last-minute interview with Van Leeuw's niece. Bowman had heard rumors of a slave who at Van Leeuw's behest had worked in the Jefferson Davis household, and he sent somebody to try and learn more. Van Leeuw's niece had been a very young child during the war, and she said, they didn't tell me much about this. I was only a little kid. Nearly 50 years had passed since the Civil War, and those did not help her memory because the few details that she insisted she did remember, especially the name Mary Elizabeth Bowser, were not accurate. But that name and the version of the story told by Bowman gets repeated, sometimes embellished with additional inaccurate details. It is the basis for that 1994 marker. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I first learned of Mary Elizabeth Bowser in 1999 from A Shining Thread of Hope, a book by Darlene Clark Hine and Catherine Thompson. It's a 300-page book, and it is one of the first overviews of African American women's history. Yet it repeats some of the same inaccuracies from the 1911 Harper's article. I think it came through other sources, but those had become the story. Darlene Clark Hine, who is a Black woman, is a founder of the field of African American women's history. She is highly respected, even revered among historians for her many contributions in the profession. And this book is a foundational text in African American women's history. But interestingly, its few paragraphs on Mary Elizabeth Bowser include none of the documentation that historians usually rely on. This is the confession that I have to make, and you, Doretta, already got me to make it at the beginning. In 1999, I was so excited, inspired by what I read there, that I spent years imagining what life for Mary Elizabeth Bowser might have been like. I wrote a novel, and at that point, it seemed that there was so little that could be known about her real life that if you wanted to produce a book, fiction was the only option. And I will say that I did change some details of her life because when you're writing a novel, you want to develop a certain kind of character arc and story arc. But I didn't write anything that I thought was implausible for the time period. And you can ask me more about that during Q&A if you want. However, research is still happening, and nearly a century after the Harper's article with its woeful single paragraph on Mary Elizabeth Bowser, there's another publication that told a fuller version of Van Leeuw's own story. It's written by University of Virginia history professor Elizabeth Varyn, and this 2003 biography is impeccably researched and thoroughly footnoted. She worked hard to find as much evidence as she could and to interpret it thoughtfully, which is what historians are always trying to do. Sorry, I've lost my place. Now, this book is a biography, which means that's a genre that is the life story. It traces Van Leeuw from her birth to her death. But as the title Southern Lady, Yankee Spy suggests, a huge focus, and it's the reason people find this life so fascinating, centers on Van Leeuw's activities during the Civil War, and particularly how she, as an upper class, white, Southern female, supported the federal government and federal military undermining the Confederacy. But what Varyn documents about those Civil War activities is how Van Leeuw worked with others towards that goal. She recounts as best she could the network that included free African Americans, enslaved Black people, European immigrants, white working class laborers and yeoman farmers, along with some other wealthy white Richmonders, all of whom participated in the ring that operated in and around the Confederate capital. Now, Professor Varyn knew Blacks were central to this network. Van Leeuw kept a diary during the war. It's not the diary that a biographer would hope that she would keep, one that would tell her day-to-day activities. Instead, it's mostly espousing her ideological views. So we don't really learn as much as we wish about what she or other members of the network did. But nevertheless, in one telling passage, she declared, quote, "Most generally, our reliable news is gathered from Negroes, and they certainly show wisdom, discretion, and prudence, which is wonderful." So we know that there are Blacks in the ring. How does Professor Varyn uncover which African Americans participated and what contributions they made? Well, she pored over pages of handwritten records from the Southern Claims Commission. This was a federal agency created in the 1870s to compensate loyal Southerners for supplies and support that they had given the federal forces during the war. People filing claims had to document what support they had offered, and they had to gather supporting testimony from witnesses. So African Americans like Sylvanus Brown and William Brisby, both free men living just outside of Richmond, documented their activities conveying military and political intelligence, escaped prisoners, and other Blacks and whites needing to flee from Richmond to federally controlled territory. They also conveyed information into the Unionists in Richmond, and they served as scouts and guides for federal troops. Brisby alone helped more than 100 people escape from the Confederacy. But to file with the Southern Claims Commission, you needed to have possessed material goods, horses, mules, wagons, a house or other shelter, crops or other food, which you gave to or used to aid federal troops. Most enslaved people were not in this position, and thus, despite their activities, we do not have any official claims detailing either their names or their specific actions. Nevertheless, enslaved people in Richmond provided vital aid to defeat the Confederacy. Professor Varyn located accounts made during and after the war by federal soldiers who'd been held as prisoners of war in Richmond. In these accounts, the soldiers recorded the aid they received from the ring, noting in particular how African-American women and men laboring in or near the prisons offered food and information, including directions on how to escape. Often they would specify how to contact Van Leeuw for further assistance. In many instances, these former prisoners' accounts credit Blacks with conveying them all the way back to federal lines. And we can easily imagine why enslaved women and men who provided this aid did not readily volunteer their names to be recorded. Now, Varyn also unearthed Reconstruction era newspaper accounts describing how men enslaved by Van Leeuw, using a pass granted to her by the Confederate government for travel between Richmond and a small farm that the Van Leeuw family owned outside the city, would cross back and forth to the federal army with military intelligence sewed into their clothes, hidden in hollowed out soles of their shoes, or tucked into eggshells from which the yolks and whites had been carefully removed. Van Leeuw kept a scrapbook throughout much of her adult life, and tucked inside is a Civil War era pass for Bob and Oliver, providing Professor Barron with the names of two of the enslaved men who presumably were part of the network. Other evidence indicates that Oliver's last name was Lewis, and that additional men enslaved by the Van Leeuws were named William Roan, Peter Roan, and James Roan, as well as two men referred to as Uncle Nelson and Anderson, for whom, as for Bob, no last name has been discovered. We can presume that all of these men had reason to work to oppose the Confederacy and were likely participants in the network. So what did Professor Barron learn about Mary Elizabeth Bowser? Very little, and yet also quite a bit. There's a 1900 Richmond newspaper article, and it was published just as Van Leeuw was dying, that had already related how she had a maid, once again referred to as, quote, of more than unusual intelligence, of more than usual intelligence, unquote, whom she placed in the Davis household. But only the Harper's article from 1911 and the interview with the niece on which it is based offer the precise name of Mary Elizabeth Bowser. When you start looking for a Mary Bowser, all that Barron could find was one document. It's a 19th century source from the Annals of St. John's Church. And this is the church where it was a wealthy white congregation. It is where the Van Leeuws were members. And in that church on April 16th, 1861, right before Virginia votes to secede from the Union, Wilson, Bowser, and Mary, servants to E.L. Van Leeuw, that's Bet's widowed mother, were married. The original church annals would have been handwritten. So the slide that I'm showing here has an excerpt from a later published edition of the parish records, saving you the trouble of trying to decipher the handwriting, which is what historians spend a lot of time doing. But we should note that the word servants here likely indicated enslaved people, and that the designation of colored in parentheses before their names, which appears very few times in all of the church annals, tells us that it was rare and noteworthy for African Americans to be welcomed to partake in sacred rites in this church. Just as we imagined earlier what it would be like to be an enslaved child within the Van Leeuw house, to understand this record fully, we need to center what it would be like to be a Black young adult entering an enslaver's church to be married, just at the moment that white men elsewhere in the same city were debating whether to secede from the United States in order to preserve the institution of slavery. Now, aside from this one record, Professor Barron could find nothing else about Mary Elizabeth Bowser, but she did discover enough to sketch out the life of Mary Jane Richards. And the first record of this Mary Jane appears in the same church annals. In 1846, Mary Jane, a colored child belonging to Mrs. Van Leeuw, is baptized in this church. And so the belonging tells us that she was indeed enslaved. Later, Bet, or perhaps her mother, arranged for Mary Jane to be educated in New Jersey. And in 1855, a Mary J. Richards, age 14, was sent to Liberia at Bet's behest. Now, located on the west coast of Africa, Liberia had been created by the American Colonization Society, an organization of wealthy whites, many of them political and religious leaders in the US. They acted from a belief that Blacks in the US needed to be returned to Africa. There were some free Blacks that embraced this opportunity to leave the United States, where racist laws and practices north and south made it difficult to earn a living, gain an education, own a home, participate in full citizenship, or even live in safety, free of verbal or physical abuse, free from the very real threat of being kidnapped and claimed as a slave, which happened even to people who were freeborn in the North. But many Blacks who went to Liberia from the US had little choice. They had lived their lives here enslaved, and their expatriation was decided for them by their enslavers, who might have felt a religious or otherwise benevolent impulse to manumit them, but who did not imagine that free Blacks had a right to full citizenship in the United States. Now, some Liberian settlers, whether they had gone of their own volition as free people or been sent as a condition of their former enslavers, thrived in Liberia. But others found little appeal to life in this strange new place, where, separated from family and friends who remained in the US, they faced hunger, disease, and armed conflict with indigenous Africans whose homelands these American Blacks now claimed for themselves. Professor Barron found Elizabeth Van Leeuw's correspondence with the American Colonization Society officials, and they indicate that the adolescent Mary Jane Richards was very unhappy in Liberia. And in 1859, Van Leeuw finally relented to Mary Jane's requests promising to pay the fare for her to return to the US, which she did in 1860. Now, the next trace that Professor Barron found are newspaper accounts from 1860, the summer of 1860, indicating that Mary Jane Richards, identified as a slave of the widow Mrs. Van Leeuw, was arrested in Richmond for going about without a pass. She also found evidence that after the war, Mary J.R. Richards, while teaching the newly emancipated in Georgia in 1867, wrote letters to and had conversations with white Northern officials, referencing her participation in the Underground Ring operating in Richmond during the war. After that, it seemed Mary Jane Richards disappeared from the historical record. Now, in that same passage that I quoted from earlier from Elizabeth Van Leeuw's journal, where she's lauding the value of the intelligence gathered by Black operatives, she singled out one source in particular. "When I open my eyes in the morning, I say to the servant, 'What news, Mary?' and my caterer never fails. Most generally, our reliable news is gathered from Negroes, and they certainly show wisdom, discretion, and prudence, which is wonderful." So you'll see that she also is regarding Mary as her servant, but she's calling out the value of what she brings to the Underground Ring. So having pieced together all the evidence she could find, Professor Barron concluded that the Mary of whom Van Leeuw wrote was Mary Jane Richards. It's possible there was another enslaved person named Mary Elizabeth Bowser, at least she hypothesized there might be, but she thought, probably with no other evidence that there was another Mary Bowser, aside from that wedding record, Mary Jane Richards had been the woman who had married Wilson Bowser. And I've since confirmed that that is the case. But the marriage was short-lived. By the war's end, she was once again using the surname Richards, and Wilson Bowser remained in Richmond long after she had left the city. But when Professor Barron published her book, she didn't yet know that for sure. This was just a hypothesis that she had. Now, it's clear if we return to that second sign, which is erected after the publication of the book, we can see how much Professor Barron's research shapes what appears on the second sign, which introduces passersby to the name Mary Jane Richards, even as it acknowledges that they may already know the legend of Mary Elizabeth Bowser. But the thing about a legend is, once it is circulated as fact, it is very hard to undo it. I don't know what will happen. If you put Mary Bowser spy into your internet search engine, I get 5.5 million results. And since Barron's book has been published, there have been other books, articles, countless online postings, and podcasts, all claiming to be history or nonfiction that have fabricated new details about Mary Bowser, rather than repeating what Barron has scrupulously proven about Mary Jane Richards. And I just want to pause, because this is the thing about where we need to think like a historian. One of these new inaccuracies, which first appeared in yet another book about white spies in which Mary is invoked to add color to the story, is a false claim that posing for years in Jefferson Davis's household, she would sew secret messages into Confederate First Lady Varina Davis's gowns, then bring the gowns to a nearby seamstress shop where the seamstress would remove the messages and Bet would retrieve them. That sounds like a very exciting Hollywood-style cloak and dagger scheme. But if you've ever done any hand sewing, you know it is very time-consuming. You also have to have a needle and thread, which are much more readily available today than they were during the Civil War. So how would an enslaved person or somebody posing as a slave have the time, liberty, material resources, and ability to hand sew secret messages into garments regularly over a period of years, consistently undetected by the person who wore those garments or any other member of the household? How could an enslaved person have the power to decide when particular garments would be removed from the enslaver's house and taken to a seamstress whose services the enslaver would have to engage and pay for? Why would a household in which an enslaved or free servant performed duties including seamstressy even need to use the services of an outside seamstress? All of this is preposterous. Moreover, that May 1864 passage from Bet's journal indicates that throughout the war, the two women were in direct conversation about intelligence gathered. So if we look at the actual evidence and we interpret it through what we know about life in this time period, we know this story is fabricated. But I also think about those rumors about the enslaved men in the underground who carried messages sewn in their clothes or hidden in their shoes. Think about how this false claim to give us an exciting version of the lone hero erases their contributions, how focusing only on Mary Elizabeth Bowser or even Mary Jane Richards erases the contributions of other African Americans who are part of this larger network. And I have to say, I don't know if this article will come up first in your search results, but I wanted to put it here in case people wanted to read on. The legend of MaryBowser can be really useful for understanding what we get wrong and why we get it wrong. And the biggest problem is that too often, the sources we privilege are sources like Elizabeth Van Leeuw's niece or the Harper's article by William Bamer, which weave a captivating tale, but simply weren't accurate in the first place. But even when we turn to the records of St. John's Church or Elizabeth Van Leeuw's correspondence with the American Colonization Society about Mary Jane Richards, or the newspaper articles about her 1860 arrest for going about without a pass, what we find is limited. These are very different kinds of sources, but they all have one thing in common. They may be about a Black person, but they were created by and for white people. What we might learn looking at evidence, what might we learn if we look at evidence that comes more directly from African Americans, particularly from an African American woman? And at the beginning of this talk, I noted that one of the exciting aspects of historical research is that sometimes new evidence emerges, forcing us to rethink what we previously believed. So I'm going to turn now to this kind of evidence. Beginning in April of 1865, immediately after the fall of the Confederacy, Mary Richards was teaching the newly emancipated, first in Richmond and other locations in Virginia. But by August, she had traveled to the north, visiting Boston and then New York and New Jersey. During this time, she gave a series of public lectures, which I've learned about through the newspaper accounts covering them. And here are two examples. One from a lecture she delivered to an interracial audience that filled Abyssinian Baptist Church in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. The other from when she addressed another overflowing crowd at the Bridge Street AWME Church in Brooklyn. The fact that she gave this series of lectures only months after the war's end suggests how quickly she connected with networks of Northern Black activists. She had to find a way to get connected with the churches and the audiences. Her networks also included prominent white military officers from whom she bore letters attesting to her wartime contributions. Now, notably, at none of these public events did she use her real name, appearing instead under the pseudonyms Richmonia Richards and Richmonia St. Pierre, likely an indication of a need to protect herself from retribution by unrepentant Confederates. But it is also worth noting that many formerly enslaved people chose new names for themselves in freedom as a way of proclaiming their full personhood. Indeed, although it seems the Van Leeuws consistently referred to her as Mary Jane, after the war, even when not using a pseudonym, she chose to go by variations of Mary, Mary J, or sometimes MJ. And for this reason, I generally refer to her as Mary rather than Mary Jane to respect how she self-identified. Now, these lectures that she gave in the North provide details about her pre-war life and her activities during the war, including her infiltration of both the Confederate Senate and the Confederate White House, the latter depicted as a place she connived herself to enter rather than being placed there by Van Leeuw. But she was not speaking to laud her own wartime courage and accomplishments. Rather, she used these engagements to outline the postbellum needs of African Americans, particularly in the South, and to demand the nation deliver. The reports of these talks from 1865 underscore that she was hardly that passive Negro girl depicted by a white writer in the later Harper's article. Speaking for herself, she clearly outlined how much there was to be done on behalf of Black people, North and South, and she adamantly instructed her audiences to do it. White Northerners owed the Negroes of the South a debt they could never repay, she said, for profiting from businesses that had relied on or been tied to slavery. She decried the behavior even of white abolitionists who refused to treat African Americans as their full equals. She also insisted Northern Blacks should not be selfish regarding their own accomplishment by denying anything, especially education, to Southern Blacks. Indeed, she advised all those who could to go south to educate the newly emancipated, as she herself had done and would continue to do. And she adamantly demanded political enfranchisement. Quote, "The bayonet has been put in the hands of the Negro. Another thing yet remains to be done. He must have the ballot," unquote. She urged swift and stern punishment of Confederates, lest they continue their atrocities against African Americans. Moreover, she attested that restoration of the Union would be of little value unless the cause of full Black citizenship was successfully pursued. For a nation ravaged by 4 deadly and devastating years of war, the fragile peace depended on how millions of newly emancipated Blacks, as well as other African Americans who had already been free, would be brought into refashioned political, legal, economic, and social systems. Having been a wartime agent for freedom, she now positions herself as a postbellum activist for racial justice. Now, as a biographer and historian, I rely on the newspaper coverage of these public lectures for details of her life, as well as for understanding the strategies she saw as necessary and efficacious for securing full citizenship for Blacks in the US. If they are simultaneously incredibly rich and incredibly frustrating sources. What we can know of these particular talks all comes through publications, and they range from the Black-owned Anglo-African to several overtly racist white newspapers. They come close to being sources from her, but each article is shaped by the assumptions and goals of the unnamed reporter who wrote it, as well as by the political and social inclinations of the readership for whom that reporter wrote. Most importantly, when I scrutinize these articles, and I'm only showing you two of the many, I detect what none of these reporters or those attending the lectures could know. In each of her talks, she was testing rhetorical strategies, varying her approaches from one appearance to another, honing what might best induce audiences of Black and white Northerners to act. To that end, she sometimes alters or even invents biographical details. This is incredibly frustrating as I try to piece together an accurate account of her life. But as her biographer, I appreciate what these carefully crafted rhetorical strategies reveal about her. Taken together, the accounts of these talks tell us a great deal about her thoughts as well as her actions, about how she was perceived, while also how carefully she strategized to shape the way that she and Blacks in general were perceived. Now, her activism is also revealed in the letters she wrote to various, didn't mean to go there yet. The letters she wrote to various US government officials in the years that followed, in which she documented acts of violence being committed or threatened by unrepentant Confederates against Southern Blacks and their white allies. Again, she demanded action be taken to secure the full liberty of African Americans. Like the newspaper accounts, the letters require careful analysis, allowing us to see how someone who was Black, female, and civilian crafted rhetorical strategies for recipients who are white, male, military, and government officials. Equally revealing, and the document that convinced me to return to this research to begin writing the biography that a decade ago I had not thought possible, was a letter that surfaced 2 years ago. It's written from New York in October of 1870. It is addressed to "My dear Miss Bet," Bet being the nickname used by Elizabeth Van Leeuw. The handwriting was unmistakable to me. It matched those letters Professor Barron and I had both already scrutinized so closely, the ones Mary J.R. Richards wrote while teaching in a small town in Georgia in 1867. And after that, it had seemed that she had just disappeared out of the historical record. But here's a letter in the same handwriting, signed M.J. Denman from New York 3 years later. It sent me to a host of new archives to discover how she came to use that name. And if you have done any genealogical research of your own, you know that one of the challenges of uncovering women in historical records is the custom of women changing their names when they marry. It wasn't that Mary Richards had disappeared in 1867, it's that she had taken a new husband and with him a new surname. Indeed, by 1870, that marriage was over, but for reasons I have yet to determine, she decided to continue using Denman rather than returning to Richards. Now, this letter is the only known extant correspondence between these two women who had such a complicated relationship. And as primary sources go, it is the kind of rich resource a biographer or historian dreams of finding because of all the details it contains and because of the many other hints it gives us of other archives and sources that it can lead us to. There isn't this time to discuss all of that today, but on a personal level, I want to share this one passage from the midst of the letter. She writes, "I hope you will not lose sight of me." She's writing this again to a woman who had been her enslaver, her fellow spy, her benefactor, but also somebody for whom in this letter she's saying, I don't want to come back to Richmond and live with you anymore. But yet she says, I hope you will not lose sight of me. When she wrote this letter, M.J. Denman, as she was then identifying, was only 30 years old. She had lived on 2 continents, including in 5 different states in the American North and South. She had been arrested, it turns out, more than once for refusing to adhere to racist laws. She had figured so centrally in the pro-union intelligence ring. She had spoken publicly in the North, taught throughout the South, faced possible violence during Reconstruction, and demanded that America do right by African Americans. And yet, she feared she would be entirely forgotten, as so many African Americans, so many women, and especially so many African-American women have been for too long in the way US history is told. It's this passage and this letter that convinced me to return to the archives, to begin the long, frustrating, and incredibly fascinating and compelling process of writing a book about her. And I'm doing this at a moment when there are similar projects from other historians. This is the Civil War Book Review just released their latest issue, and it is all devoted to Black activism in the Civil War era. So you can find article after article reviewing new books in this field. More and more books are focusing on the agency and centrality of African Americans in terms of ending slavery and in terms of winning the Civil War, in terms of their activism before and after the war to win the full rights of citizenship in every jurisdiction, North and South. And I feel so fortunate to be learning from and with so many thoughtful, dedicated historians who are bringing greater depth, greater breadth, and greater accuracy to our understanding of the past. Now, the book I'm working on will be the first scholarly biography of this incredible person, and it is years away from being done because historical research is slow and takes a lot of work. But soon enough, as you may remember, Mary Bowser Denman will have a stick, one that I am proud to have collaborated on with Jennifer Leeuw of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. And we've drafted the text. It has not yet been officially approved, but this is what we are hoping the stick will tell you. Mary Bowser Denman was born enslaved in Virginia circa 1840. Given de facto freedom by Elizabeth Van Leeuw, whose family enslaved her, she was educated in New Jersey and sent to live in Liberia before returning to Richmond in 1860. During the Civil War, she participated in a secret network of free and enslaved African Americans and pro-Union whites, including Van Leeuw, who assisted federal prisoners of war and passed intelligence to the US Army. Denman, who used various names throughout her life, later taught in schools for the formerly emancipated in Virginia, Florida, and Georgia, gave lectures in the North, and was an activist for equal rights and full citizenship for Black Americans. I have to admit, it is hard to escape the lone hero trope when you're in the realm of history on a stick. But hopefully, whoever reads this will understand the vast network of activists who shaped Virginia and the US, and how much we owe them as we continue to work today to achieve racial justice and gender justice long overdue in America. Happy Juneteenth, everybody.
That was fantastic. Let me see how I get my picture back on the screen. But thank you so much for sharing the story of this incredible woman with us, and your the detective work that you have done so far.
Well, I think that for me, that's really what I want to convey to audiences when I give talks, or to readers when I write, is not just what happened, but to understand how historians know what happened, that being able to find good evidence, evaluate the quality of the evidence, know how to interpret the evidence, it's as important for us as it is for scientists or for people who work in medicine. And I think it's really a skill that we see the value of, but in some ways the internet, which is always willing to give us the answer to any question as though it's the accurate answer, is teaching us not to be critical about the answers we receive. So the detective work, it is clearly part of the fun for me, but I think it's part of also understanding why our ideas about history change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And how important the work of diligent historical research is. So thank you for going out on that journey and uncovering the true history of Mary J. Richards. So tell me a little more about her situation during the Civil War. Was she actually enslaved, and why did Elizabeth Van Leeuw continue to enslave African Americans even though she was trying to undermine the Confederacy?
Right. So I should say, first of all, that not all whites who were pro-Union in the South were against slavery. And in fact, Virginia is a great case study of this, because the state that we now consider West Virginia seceded from the rest of Virginia because it did not want to secede from the Union. And West Virginia entered as its own state, became its own state as part of the United States in 1864 as a slave state. So it's after the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's still coming in as a slave state, and there were other slave states that had not seceded. So to assume that somebody was pro-union is not to say that they were anti-slavery. But the case of the Van Leeuws is a little bit more complicated. Now, one of the reasons that Elizabeth Van Leeuw could do everything that she did is that when her father died in 1843, she was a teenager. Am I telling you a lie? I'm telling you a lie. She was in her early 20s. And she, in that will, received an inheritance, and it specified that both she and her sister would retain their money as their own even if they ever married. But because she had this inheritance, she was not dependent on having to marry. She and her mother both had a fair bit of financial independence after her father's death. But in that same will, he also directed that her mother, the widow, could not manumit or sell any of the enslaved people that he was leaving in his will. She had the right to use them during her lifetime, but after she died, they had to go to the rest of her heirs. This meant that Mary and all these other enslaved people were in an incredibly precarious position, because while Elizabeth Van Leeuw might have wanted to act in a certain way, she was not the only heir. We don't know what would have happened if her mother had died while slavery was still in practice. So we say that she was given her de facto freedom. And it does seem from Professor Barron's research that the Van Leeuw women sort of looked the other way as some of the enslaved people took their freedom. They might have assisted them into slipping out of slavery, even though they couldn't free them legally. But it's also true that newly emancipated people could not stay in the state of Virginia for more than a year. So if you were an enslaved person and you had the opportunity to buy yourself free, or somebody in your family had the opportunity to buy you, if you wanted to stay in Virginia, you couldn't do that as a newly freed person. This was a fairly recent law. So there were free Blacks who lived in the state. And it meant that if you were a Black family that had free and enslaved members, the only way to stay together might be for the free members of the family to actually own other members of the family. It's an incredibly disturbing thing to think about, that dynamic. So we're not entirely sure. And the Van Leeuw women weren't necessarily anti-slavery from the start. It seems like that is a position that they grew to over time. So they might have also felt some kindness to particular people who were enslaved by them. I mentioned that Mary was sent to Liberia. There were other enslaved children in that household who were not sent north to be educated, who were not expatriated to Liberia. And it's hard to know how to read that difference.
Right. Do you have any idea why Mary was sent to New Jersey to be educated and then Liberia and not some of the others?
It's hard to say. And I should say that I am coming to the Commonwealth of Virginia to spend 4 months as a Virginia Humanities Fellow in the Library of Virginia. And I hope to learn more about this while I'm doing that archival research. I was supposed to be there last fall, but as we know, many things that we hoped were going to happen over the past year couldn't because of the pandemic. So it's not entirely clear yet. It's interesting because there's never any mention of never anything specific about who Mary's parents were. And I'm not sure what that means about whether her mother may have died when she was very young or even in childbirth. And so she was a little bit more of a orphaned in the world. And so Bet chose to treat her in a particular way, whereas other of the children in the household might have had family members. And so moving them around would have meant more clearly breaking up a family. But that's a gut instinct. That is nothing that I can prove at all, at least not yet. Mm-hmm. Ask me again in a few years.
I've got 2 more questions for you. One is, do you know when the historical marker will be unveiled?
No, I'm certainly hoping that it won't be unveiled before September, because I would love to be there for it. And I think that in June is when they're going to finalize what the text will be. And I just don't know what the schedule is.
Exciting. And then one last question. A little bit of historical speculation, but if you could ask Mary one question, what would you ask her?
You know, that's a great question. It's like if she was a genie, could I ask for more wishes? There is a photograph that circulates on the internet, and it says that it's of MaryBowser, and it's just not of this woman. It's of another woman named MaryBowser who was who lived much later. And there's an article that I wrote about that that's in the Atlantic, and folks who are interested can find it. It's called "The Spy Photo That Fooled US Military Intelligence, NPR, and Me." And I talk about why it is that we want to find a picture of somebody who it's not at all surprising that there's no picture of her. But in the article, I say, if I could ask her something, if I could just know one more thing about her, it wouldn't be, what does she look like? So you're asking me what I would ask her. I mean, part of the way I frame that question right now is that I find her in 1870 in New York through that letter. I found her again, but I lose track of her at this point in 1872. And that's very young. And so really, if there's one thing I could know, it would be something that could lead me to more information, right? I mean, I suppose if she would love to tell her whole life story, I would love to hear it. But I think sometimes what I'm looking for most is the piece that will lead to the next piece. And also, and again, here I'm really grateful to so many other historians working in the field to think about how to interpret even a letter that Bet writes to the American Colonization Society about Mary. How can I read that letter in a way where I'm really trying to figure out what Mary's actions and thoughts are from this second or third hand account of things that she's done, which is not even very detailed. It's like she's been badly behaved. Well, what does her bad behavior mean? How was she choosing her behavior to get what she wanted, which was to come home from Liberia? So I don't think that there's necessarily one thing that I would ask her. I guess if there was one thing I would tell her is, you know, she was worried that that passage that I read about, please do not lose sight of me. It continues, for I would not want to think there is no one who cares for my weal or woe. I don't think she would understand the internet and search engines and 5.5 million hits, but I would like to tell her that there are many people today who are very interested in her story, and for whom I hope that we can represent her weal and woe as accurately as possible.
Wow, and that's a perfect ending to a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much, Lois. If any of our viewers have any further questions for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
I'm findable versus a lot of the social media giants. I usually don't like to promote any corporations, but I will say that if you are on either Twitter or Facebook, you can just use the names of those and then / Lois Leveen, LOISLEVEEN. And my email is booking, BOOKING, @loisleveen.com. And I think you can look at the program information for today if you're not sure how to spell Lois Leveen. Yeah, and again, perhaps I'll see you around Virginia when I'm in Richmond this fall.
That would be wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone who viewed it, who showed interest in American history again. It's always a pleasure to have you join us for these talks. If you'd like to make a donation to the American Frontier Culture Foundation, who supports a program like the lecture series, please go on our website. In the lower left corner, you will find a donate button that will take you to the donate page. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you to the American Frontier Culture Foundation for supporting this lecture series. And take care, everyone. Hope to see you at the next lecture. Bye.